So I'd like to talk just a little bit about the idea of headship in the book of Ephesians and bring together some thoughts that I find helpful when we look at the discussion about, particularly in Ephesians 5, what does it mean to say that a husband is the head of the wife? So, first, I want to talk briefly about metaphors. Metaphors, clearly, when you translate them, don't necessarily work in the language that you translate them into. So, to look at just a few examples, in Isaiah 66:14, the Hebrew says, "Your bones will sprout like grass," which I just find really amusing. This idea of these bones with grass growing out of them, or maybe it's the bones that grow up out of the dirt. I don't know what the image is supposed to look like. What it means, though, is you will flourish like grass. Now, that's the way we say it in English. You will flourish like grass. There's nothing wrong with saying your bones will sprout like grass. It's just that in English, that doesn't mean anything. We have different idioms to mean the same thing. Another example in Psalm 37:8, the Hebrew says, "Leave your nose alone," which to English speakers sounds like God is telling us to stop picking our noses, I guess. But actually, what that metaphor means is refrain from anger. So again, we have a reference to a body part, and it makes perfect sense in the original language. But if we translate it without understanding what it originally meant, we're going to misunderstand. Another example in Luke, in the New Testament, this time in Luke 178, it says, "Because of the compassionate intestines of our God," or we might say the bowels of mercy of our God. But we don't talk like that in English. So when we translate it into English, the NIV says, "Because of the tender mercy of our God." We might say the compassionate heart of our God, because in English we think of the heart as the place where our emotions are. So now we're going to be looking at this metaphor. A husband is the head of the wife. And we just assume that we know what that means because we use the word head as a metaphor in English also. And when we say in English, a husband is the head of the wife, we generally mean that he's the boss. If you're the head of the company, you're the boss. You're the one responsible, but you're also the one who's in charge. And everybody has to do what you say or lose their jobs, right? And that's the idea in English of one person being the head of another person. In Greek, however, although the word head could mean that, it frequently meant something very different. So I want to show you some images that'll help us to sort of wrap our heads around what it would mean in Greek, what the idea of a head would mean in Greek in metaphorical use. So one helpful image is the image of headwaters. So we use the word head in English to talk about the headwaters, and the headwaters are this area up here where all the water for the river comes from. This is the source of the water of the river, and it's also the beginning, the origin of the river. It starts up here, and the water is provided from up there. And those are some of the other ideas that are inherent in the word head, the way it's used metaphorically in Greek. So it could mean the starting place. It could mean the origin. It could mean the place where the supply comes from, the place where the provisions come from. So here's another image that's helpful. Here we see the idea of a head can mean supply provision because it is through the head that we get our air and our water and our food. So all of the things that the body needs in order to grow and to stay alive, they come from our head. And so that's the idea behind the use of head for provider or supply. Another image that I think is helpful as we think about these issues is the image of creation and Eve being created from Adam's side. And here, if we talk about Adam being Eve's head, we can think about this idea of headship as source. Man is the source of woman because woman was made from man. Now let's look at the ways that the word head is used in the book of Ephesians. In chapter 1, verses 22 and 23, it mentions that Christ is the head over everything for the sake of the church. And it says that the church is the overflow of Christ who fills everything. Now, this is the one place in the book that I think head could mean ruler over. But here, the author of Ephesians has felt the need to add that word over. Even though some translations in English will say he's the head of everything, the Greek actually makes it clear by adding the word over, the head over everything. And that word isn't included in either of the other uses of the word head. The other really interesting thing in this passage is the picture that's being given to us, because the Ephesians 1:22 and 23 doesn't say that Christ is the head over the church. Instead, it says that he is the head over everything for the sake of the church. And we see that the church receives everything from Christ. And so, this image of Christ supplying everything that the church needs is already there in that passage. The next place where the word head is used is in chapter 4, verse 15. And here it says that Christ is the head and holds the church together and gives it what it needs to grow. So again, we see the image that's being created here is of Christ as provider for the church. And then when we get to chapter 5, verses 21 through 33, what are husbands being asked to do? They're being asked to love, to give of themselves, to feed, and to care for the wives. So that fits very nicely with this idea of the head as provider. Now, if we look at the context of Ephesians 5:21 through 33, I'm going to go back up to chapter 5, starting at verse 15. And Ephesians tells us, be careful how you live. And then after that, it says, be filled with the Spirit. And then what are you going to do if you're filled with the Spirit? How is that going to play out in your life if you're living the way you should, filled by the Spirit? Well, first, it says that we're going to sing. And then the second thing we're going to do is we're going to give thanks. And then the third thing we're going to do is we're going to submit to one another. And then after telling us to submit to one another, the author of Ephesians sort of goes off on a rabbit trail and uses the example of a marriage as a place where we can submit to one another. And so remember in the slide with the metaphors, I gave you the original language of the text and the way we need to translate it into English so that we understand the meaning of the metaphor. I'm going to do that here with Ephesians 5:21 through 33. I started with the NIV and I made some changes so that we can better understand what the text is communicating with this metaphor of headship. Submit yourselves to one another out of reverence for Christ, wives to their own husbands as to the Lord, because a husband is a provider for his wife, just as Christ is a provider for the church. He is the preserver of the body. But as the church submits to Christ, so also the wives to their husbands in everything. Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, so that he could make her holy, cleansing her by washing her with water by his word, and so that he could present the glorious church to himself, without any stain or wrinkle or any such thing, but so that she might be holy and blameless. Thus the husbands ought to love their own wives as their own bodies. The one who loves his own wife loves himself, for no one ever hated his own body. Rather, he feeds and cherishes her, just as Christ also feeds and cherishes the church, because we are parts of his body. Thus, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. This is a great mystery, but I mean Christ and the church. In any case, each of you who live in unity, let each thus love his own wife as himself, and the wife, may it be that she respects her husband. Now, the first thing I noticed when I first looked at this passage in Greek is how gently it tells women, wives, to obey their husband. If you notice, it's sometimes the word isn't even repeated. There's no place where anybody is pointing a finger and say, you should obey. Now, that doesn't mean that wives shouldn't submit to husbands, but it does suggest that this is not a unilateral submission, especially because in the ancient world, submitting to husbands was an obvious thing that wives were supposed to do. Wives were often about 10 years younger than their husbands. They would usually have been legally and financially dependent on them. And that doesn't even seem to be what Paul is focusing on here. What Paul is doing here is he's inverting the expected roles of a husband and wife. Notice that husbands are asked to love and to wash and to feed, and those are typically feminine things to do. And so we see this idea of mutual submission then, as wives continue to submit to husbands as they've always been expected to do. But the new thing is now that husbands are being asked to submit to wives by loving them, by caring for them, and by providing for them. Thus, the conclusion is that this is an example of mutual submission. Thanks for listening.